Good morning. On behalf of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, I welcome you all to the launch of our 2021 Media for Democracy Forum with our first of 4 panels, Global Disinformation versus Democracy, Confronting the Existential Threat, co-hosted by Aspen Digital, a program of the Aspen Institute. We are excited to build on the terrific 2019 Media for Democracy Forum, in which a number of you participated after taking 2020 off due to the pandemic. Let's just say it is very good to be back. For those who aren't familiar, USAGM is the federal agency that brings together 5 public service news networks: The Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Liberty, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Middle East Broadcasting, and Radio TV Marti. We also oversee a 6th entity devoted to supporting internet freedom, the Open Technology Fund. The agency's mission is to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. And we fulfill this mission by reaching over 354 million adults worldwide with accurate, independent, and professional news in 62 languages. Earlier this week, we observed World Press Freedom Day, an occasion to remind governments of their duty to uphold the right to freedom of expression enshrined under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I say observed and not celebrated, as in the 2 years since we last hosted this forum, we have witnessed one of the most alarming periods for media freedom in modern history. The entire sector is now confronted with the trilateral threat of, first, rampant government pressure on journalists, media outlets, and even communications infrastructure. Second, the erosion of sustainable business models for independent media, often resulting in media capture. And third, the explosion of institutional disinformation, campaigns by state and non-state actors to erode trust in news and in democratic institutions writ large. It is this third threat, the looming menace of disinformation, that we will focus on today. The low barriers to entry in the information marketplace, as well as the ease of scaling up, have created a unique opportunity for widespread disinformation campaigns. So-called fake news has been weaponized at a speed and reach previously unimaginable. The rise of disinformation threatens to sow distrust, not just towards particular policies, but if left unchecked, it may pose an existential threat to the very institutions that form the foundation of any functioning democratic society. As we turn to tackling this challenge, we need to place the threat of disinformation into the political and media ecosystems within which it operates. Disinformation does not exist in a vacuum, and its success or failure is defined by the political economy of the technical and social systems it lives on. This is to say, the effectiveness of disinformation campaigns, even simple efforts to distract and deceive, speaks to the fragility of our current information environment and the need to invest in public service media with a proven track record of sustaining healthy, robust, and resilient civil societies. We are very excited to be working with Aspen Digital on today's program, as their work in the future of media freedom is unparalleled. The panel brings together some of the best minds on this issue from a variety of experiences all around the world. This morning's discussion will look at hot spots of disinformation and weakening democracies and attempt to address what we can do as practitioners, as journalists, academics, and concerned citizens to shore up support for our democratic values and institutions. Before I introduce today's perspicacious moderator, Vivian Schiller, who will orchestrate the terrific discussion ahead, I want to take care of some housekeeping. First, I would like to thank my team, and specifically Mahmoud Kazmi, for his leadership in envisioning and organizing today's event. Next, for those of you watching live, you can see that there is a chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. We will have time for questions, and it is in this chat where you can submit those questions for our panelists. We will do our best to answer as many as we can, and please do be active if you have any questions for the group. We can also continue the conversation on Twitter. We are at USAGMGov, and please use the hashtag M4DF21. I hope you will take a moment to register for the next panel of the Media for Democracy Forum. It is co-hosted by the Committee to Protect Journalists on the topic of overcoming global threats to independent journalism. It is scheduled for 3 weeks from today, May 26th at 9 a.m., and you can register the same way that you registered for this panel. Now, back to our moderator. In working with Vivian on this program, we've been repeatedly impressed with the extent of her personal understanding of global media issues and the network she has gathered of brilliant minds around every part of the digital media universe. She is, of course, the Executive Director of Aspen Digital, whose recent work has included major research on national cybersecurity policy, and most recently, leading the formation of Aspen's Commission on Information Disorder. Vivian has previously served as the President and CEO of NPR, the global chair of news at Twitter, and the general manager of NYT and NewYorkTimes.com. Truly an honor to collaborate with Aspen Digital and a pleasure to turn it over to you, Vivian. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shawn. And hi, everybody. I have to say, this is the first time I have ever been called perspicacious, which does not roll off the tongue. And I will admit, I must not be that educated because I had to look it up. So before we get into the program, because many of us are in the news industry and we cannot resist breaking news. I just wanted to share briefly that the oversight board, the Facebook oversight board, just handed down their decision on the suspension of Trump, and they have upheld Facebook's decision. However, so he's not going to be reinstated immediately. They have upheld the decision to deplatform Trump. However, they have asked that Facebook, they take issue with the fact that the suspension is indefinite, and they're giving Facebook 6 months to reassess this penalty. So I'm going to ask our panelists about this a little bit later in the program because it is directly related to everything we're talking about today. So first of all, it's an honor to partner with USAGM on this event, which is personally very important to me. I've really dedicated my career to journalism in the public interest and often at the front lines of digital innovation. And while we live in a time of really exciting opportunity and possibility, at the same time, the last year has shown us to be also in a state of peril. You know, the traditional adversaries are still at work, but now new threats have emerged. Even in the last year, many state leaders are pushing into full-blown autocracy. And domestic actors in the US are threatening the very foundations of democracy. Speaking of January 6th and speaking of Trump's Facebook post. But let me not spend any more time on what you already know, because we really have an extraordinary set of panelists with us today, and they can bring this crisis and the issues to light and share their insights and then share with us what they think needs to happen to get us out of this mess. So here's the plan for the next period of time. I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn, ask them to offer some reflections, then we're going to have a conversation. But all along the way, we're going to be taking your questions, which is the best part of the program. So please do share. And when you offer your questions, if you feel comfortable doing so, please add your name, your affiliation, and where in the world you are coming from. If you feel comfortable, it's not required, but it gives great context to your question. Okay, so let's get started. Peter, I am going to start with you. Peter Pomerantsev is the senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University, where he co-directs the ARENA initiative, which is a research project dedicated to overcoming the challenges of digital era disinformation and polarization. He has written 2 award-winning books, one on Russia propaganda called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which I highly recommend. And more recently, This Is Not Propaganda. He has written for everyone from the New York Times to the Atlantic. So Peter, thank you so much for being with us today. Your research has taken you everywhere from Europe to Southeast Asia to Latin America, trying to understand the tectonic shifts in global information that many of us really haven't been able to grasp, or at least haven't been able to stitch together. And I think in a way that you can. So that's why we're starting with you to give us the big picture. So as an academic and an analyst from the global view, how do you see disinformation, and is it a threat to democracy?
Thank you very much. And yeah, as I'm talking first, I'll try to give sort of these larger issues for us to sort of base the conversation on. I mean, there is a pattern of what's going on when one goes from market to market, geography to geography. What seems like chaos does sort of crystallize into a kind of a structural pattern. And essentially what we're dealing with the advent of digital technology, but a lot of other factors, is what I suppose one could term the sort of structural disintegration of the democratic public sphere. For all the many, many benefits digital technology has brought, it's also kind of questioned the assumptions on which we based a democratic information environment as opposed to a dictatorial one. What do I mean by that? We used to think that, dictatorships, they censored people by squeezing the information space, by throwing dissidents in jail and shutting down their publications. And that still happens in a huge amount of places, especially the ones where USAGM works. But there's a new threat which turns this on its head. We now see the use of online disinformation campaigns. And by disinformation, I mean both in terms of content, but more importantly, in terms of behavior, mass armies of trolls and bots and so on, who pretend to be real people, but aren't. What the platforms call coordinated inauthentic behavior. And they're used to attack critics, drive out democratic conversation. But that's just adding to the information out there and the disinformation out there. That's not about censorship in terms of squeezing the information space. It's censorship in terms of overloading it. But we don't really have any kind of legal or even philosophical ways to deal with this. We're used to saying more information is better, the marketplace of ideas. Well, in the digital era, the marketplace of ideas, if it ever worked, is probably not a very good metaphor. Moving on, pluralism. Pluralism was always meant to guarantee democracy. Now we see pluralism tipping into polarization so vicious, any chance of democratic discourse breaks down. And finally, the ideal of the free flow of information across borders, which is the ideal that democratic forces campaigned for throughout the 20th century, is now used to kind of hypercharge different types of subversive activity and information war. So look, the challenge that we face, and it's similar challenges that we face across the world, really, lead us to address these structural challenges. The panel I think we have today is amazing in that it's really on the front lines of dealing with these issues, and I'll let them go into them in depth.
Oops, thank you so much, Peter. I just a quick follow-up. There's been a remarkable shift, I think, in the last few years. You talk about the original concept of the marketplace of ideas. Twitter used to proudly declare itself this free speech wing of the free speech party. But with this flooding, like you say, it's not just about mis and disinformation. It's the flooding the zone with nonsense and garbage from part of these coordinated, inauthentic behavior campaigns that has really, tipped a popular opinion away from the idea that more information is good. But there's limits to that, no doubt, right?
Look,
where do we draw the line?
Look, I'm not, let's first pass this concept of disinformation and information very, very, very briefly. I don't think if the question that we're talking about here is, what is the role of censorship, especially given the ruling that happened just now with Donald Trump, I don't think censorship and starting censoring content is going to be a very productive way forward. There might be, we do have laws about, censoring content that leads to physical harm. Those laws exist already. We can root ourselves in those laws. But what we're really talking about here is not so much content in the digital era. We're talking about scale, targeting, amplification. Those are the things we can think about. We can think about regulating them. If we're going to have a real public square out there, it should generally be one person, one voice. Yeah, what we have at the moment is one person controlling thousands and thousands of fake accounts pretending to be people. We can change that. I'm not talking about anonymity. I think anonymity is a right. I think you can wear a mask at a party as long as you're one person wearing a mask, not a person controlling 3,000 masks pretending to be people. That's where the new bit of the digital environment is. I think we over-obsess with one tweet saying you're fake news. The problem is a million tweets saying it at the same time as part of a campaign. And we can do something about that. We just have to start understanding what's new about this environment. We have to slightly move away from thinking about broadcast and newspapers where we were fixated on content and start thinking about design, about amplification, and about what's really unique about this environment.
Great, thank you. We're going to follow up with you later about what it is we can do about this, but thank you. Maria Ressa, we are now turning to you. So I feel like Maria Ressa needs no introduction, but of course I'm going to do it anyway because I just feel proud to be able to do it. Her CV does not do justice to the role that Maria plays on the global stage when it comes not just to press freedom, but to the integrity of the world information ecosystem. I first met Maria more than 20 years ago when we were both at CNN. She was a bureau chief and reporter for CNN in Southeast Asia. And then she made the leap to entrepreneurship and founded Rappler, which has really become one of the most cutting edge digital news platforms out there. It's based in Manila in the Philippines, but its reach is very much global. She led that organization, of course, the only way that Maria knows how, which is as an independent, intrepid news reporter. And in the Philippines, of course, you cannot be an independent, intrepid news reporter without crossing the powerful Rodrigo Duterte. So it was not long after he went after her and after her news organization. So countless indictments later on trumped up bogus charges, Maria thankfully is still here with us and able to speak freely, but she endures a persistent torrent of online abuse. And yet, Maria, you persevere. You are not just the leader of Rappler, but you are also a leading voice fighting against disinformation on social media platforms, particularly Facebook. So thank you again for being here, and congratulations on Maria. You just received the very prestigious UNESCO Press Freedom Prize, which is so well deserved. So thanks again for being with us. So my question to you, from the center of the storm vantage point, which you very much are, how do you see disinformation as a threat to democracy?
It's insidious manipulation on a micro scale and a macro scale. The micro scale is at the individual level. When individuals get targeted by disinformation, meaning influence operations, it does two things. The target is the only one who sees all the attacks, right? And then not only is it meant to pound you to silence, it also creates kind of like a bandwagon effect. So a manufactured consensus is how Oxford University referred to it. So that's the target on the individual. But who carries out the disinformation, the influence operations or information operations? You exceedingly find that not only are they local, they're global. So in the Philippines, for example, I'm a target, right? One of many. Anyone who is a journalist, a human rights activist, an opposition politician, from 2016 to today, we've been targeted. But those local structures in the networks of disinformation also connect globally. So not only have I been targeted by state-sponsored pro-Duterte accounts, I've also, last September, Facebook took down an information operations that was doing several things. It was coming from China, number one. It was attacking Southeast Asia, but was most successful in the Philippines. It was creating fake accounts using AI-generated photos for the US elections. And what was it doing here in the Philippines? It was campaigning for the daughter of President Duterte. He can't run again. We have presidential elections next year, so it's premature campaigning. A Chinese influence operation campaigning for the daughter of Duterte. It was also attacking me because it was right after the verdict. So, I mean, look, just to take it from there, I think the critical problem is that this allows insidious manipulation at scale. And I'll end it with this great quote. And I don't think it's a coincidence that E.O. Wilson is a biologist who studies ants, meaning emergent behavior, right? What happens when all of us come together and we lose individuality because the group, as it gets bigger, exerts influence on the individual. His quote, E.O. Wilson said this, he said, the biggest problem is our Paleolithic emotions, so our biology, our Paleolithic emotions, our medieval institutions, and our godlike technology.
Ooh, that is chilling, actually. So this notion of appealing to our sort of baser, innate reptilian instincts, weaponized at scale by the technologies that we now have available to us. That's what you're experiencing. How you're observing.
So I would say made a little bit worse because at the scale we're talking about, it creates emergent behavior, right? We're not in control of it, neither is the algorithm, but because the design puts us together in a particular way, it does things. What do you see on the social media platforms? Hate speech, conspiracy theories. I'm worried about the state of humanity, right? Because I believe people are basically good, but in our information ecosystem today, the social media platforms that deliver the facts, which is the core of democracies, the core of any meaningful human endeavor, the platforms that deliver the facts are biased against facts. That's what all the studies have shown, Vivian.
Oh, great. Thank you, Maria. We're gonna come back to you. But I want to turn now. We have two more other wonderful panelists. So I'm going to turn now to Daisy Cindelar. She is a distinguished print and broadcast journalist with a career that has spanned decades in Russia and Eastern Europe. Several years ago, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, in cooperation with Voice of America, all part of USAGM, which is a co-host of this session, of course, launched Current Time, a 24-hour Russian language news and information platform, as an alternative to Kremlin-controlled media and as, quote, a reality check on the disinformation that is driving conflict in the region. So welcome, Daisy. We're so glad you're with us, and we'd like to focus on your part of the world. As we well know, as is well documented, Russia is a major vector for disinformation campaigns, the kind of coordinated, inauthentic behavior that Peter referred to via bots and other coordinated networks. So how does that impact your work? And have you found an audience for evidence-based information in Russia? And does that put you in the crosshairs of the Kremlin?
Vivian, thank you so much. And I want to say hello to everyone. Thanks so much to USAGM and Aspen Digital for sponsoring a really interesting, very important conversation. It's great to be among very distinguished company. Just a little bit by way of context, as Shawn mentioned at the top, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is part of the USAGM family. It's one of the 5 broadcasters under the USAGM umbrella. And RFERL works in 27 languages across 23 countries. But for the purposes of this conversation, a lot of what we do, as indicated by Vivian's question, is work in Russia and the former Soviet space. So I wanted to talk about an example that has been was interesting for us because it was something where we could pinpoint in advance that disinformation was going to be used to drive a particular news cycle. And, when you're talking about Russia and disinformation, of course, it's not only how they're communicating with their own audience, but how they're communicating cross borders to countries where there are still a lot of Russian speakers, a legacy of the Soviet Union, a lot of people who are still consuming news and information in Russia. And in fact, Vivian mentioned Current Time. The concept behind Current Time is to create a Russian language news and information channel that is meant not only for audiences inside Russia, but outside, understanding that there is still a massive amount of news being consumed in the Russian language by people who aren't necessarily Russian. And so we were trying to come up with an alternative to what was almost exclusively Kremlin-dominated media for Russian speakers. So when you're talking about cross-border disinformation, obviously one of the starkest examples that comes up on a regular basis is Ukraine. And of course, over the past month, we witnessed a really scary moment with the massive escalation of potential military hostilities with a Russian troop buildup on Ukraine's eastern borders. But something happened before that happened, and that was that a report was circulated. It began on social media that was used by pro-Russian populations in Ukraine's east about the death of a child. A 5-year-old boy had been killed in an explosion that was blamed on the use of an unmanned drone that was operated by the Ukrainian military. And this report was horrific. It was quickly picked up by state and pro-Kremlin media outlets. There were dozens of headlines and television news coverage of this single incident, and it provoked a very high-level reaction from Russian officialdom, including the State Duma speaker, who went immediately to the issue of European institutions, tying this incident to the lack of reaction that he was seeing from the West. So he pointed to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and to the OSCE organizations, which he said love wasting their breath, and said, why aren't you doing something about this? Why aren't you asking Ukraine for an explanation for this horrible reported incident? And even said that, Ukraine from this point forward should be excluded from membership in the Council of Europe. So, and when no really vocal reaction was emanating from either the Ukrainian president's office, the United States, or other Western governments or institutions, Russia used that as further opportunity to interpret this as a horrible incident that had the tacit approval of the West. So what we do know, thanks to fact-checking organizations like Stop Fake that do fantastic work in Ukraine, is that the story was not true. It was unfortunately partially true because a child had been killed, but he had been killed when he discovered an unexploded mine that had been left in the yard of his grandfather's house where he was staying. So certainly a horrible, very regrettable incident, but not one that in any way involved the Ukrainian military. But by the time the truth had come out about this story, it had already had its intended effect or effects, which were to, on the one hand, unnerve the Ukrainian population, to discredit Western organizations and institutions who were turning a blind eye to a seemingly, horrific incident. And perhaps most importantly of all, it was stirring outrage among the Russian audience that was literally being bombarded with headlines about this incident, and making what came next, which was this troop buildup, seem logical and even morally justified. So if the story seems familiar, it's because it is. We saw the exact same tactic used by the Russians at the start of the war with Ukraine in 2014, when Russian sources in similar fashion talked about an apparent eyewitness of a young mother being killed by a Ukrainian soldier and her baby being crucified. The story had absolutely no bearing in reality, but it went a long way towards rechanneling what would be absolutely normal human repulsion into a kind of logical justification for the military action that followed. So, as you know, we saw the troop draw down last month, which is good news, but still Putin achieved what he set out to do, which is deeply unnerving Ukraine, making the Ukrainian government seem weak and ill-prepared. And he also reminded his own voting populace, which has parliamentary elections quite critically later this year, that the enemy is at the gate. And, from the perspective of this particular conversation, what's most worrying of all is that he really used it at a moment when relations between Russia and the West are as poor as they are. He used it as a fresh opportunity to get the West's attention by really taking a shot at the EU and taking a shot at transatlantic institutions. So it's not often that we see Russia playing the child card, which is good because it's extremely distasteful, but they do it when the stakes are very high. And this is one of these instances where they were signaling that something is coming. And at this point, journalists have become so adept at interpreting how disinformation is used and how these stories are used, that the minute that the story went out there, it was clear that something bigger was coming.
So you really, these anecdotes, these horrific anecdotes you're telling are illustrating the points that Peter and Maria made, which is this notion of flooding the zone with falsehoods, and particularly with a story that, as Maria points out, is designed to touch us viscerally, and so that we respond in a very sort of almost emotional way. But you take it one step further now by saying, and it is a means to a very, very specific end. Here you are alleging that it was all in preparation to this troop buildup to sort of sow the grounds of popular opinion for this premeditated move.
That's exactly right, and I think your use of the word visceral is perspicacious, Vivian, because exactly right. I think probably
my new favorite word.
Even residents within the pro-Russian territories in Ukraine were saying, we know this story is not true. However, the image and the emotions that even a blast of a story like that can evoke in people is something they can't get rid of. And so even if they know to question, is the story legitimate or is it not, I think their minds have already been open to the possibility, well, it could be true. And in that way, the effect is almost as significant as if it was completely borne out.
Thank you, Daisy. We're now going to move on to our final panelists, and then we'll go into more conversation. And again, reminder, we're going to take your questions. Please, we're taking those questions now. We want to hear from you. We'll get to you in a few minutes, anybody that's listening. First of all, we were supposed to have Naresh Fernandez. Unfortunately, he could not make it. He had an illness in his family. He made note that it was not COVID related, but it certainly could have been, given what is going on in India. But we are so thankful that we have with us SNIGDHA POONAM. Thank you so much for joining us. SNIGDHA is an award-winning journalist and writer based in India. Her articles have appeared in India media, the highest caliber India media like Scroll and The Caravan, but also in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Economist, The Atlantic, the FT. She is the author of Dreamers, How Young Indians Are Changing the World, and her new book, Scammers, is coming out later this year. India, of course, is frequently lauded as the world's most populous democracy, but we've seen a troubling rise of mis and disinformation on India's elections and public health. So journalists in India are really that last line of defense. SNIGDHA, first, our deep condolences for the entire nation on the tragic spike in COVID cases in India these past few weeks, and just the crushing burden on your health infrastructure. It's just heartbreaking to see. So, but we're so grateful that you took the time to join us in the middle of this crisis, though of course, this crisis is not unrelated to our topic, as we see so much mis and disinformation and attempts to squash legitimate information by the government and government actors. So how do you see disinformation as a threat in India, especially in the context of the current crisis?
Thank you, Vivian. It's a terrible time for us. I can hear ambulance sirens going off every now and then. It's very disorienting, but I'll try to speak as reasonably as I can. I mean, India is the world's most populous democracy. It has unfortunately also come to be known as one of the worst case studies for the dangerous effects of misinformation and disinformation. And indeed, I mean, in the last 5 years, there have been spate of mob lynchings and riots that were fueled by messages that were aimed at creating religious bigotry. What's more, what concerns me more is the fact, I mean, knowing this as a journalist, that those messages that led to so many killings were manufactured, politically manufactured, in this very vast setup. It's really vast infrastructure that has come to exist in India. Whether you talk about the numbers of people who work in it, the amount of funding that goes into it, the kind of advanced technology that's being used, and all of this to create and to circulate falsehoods and prejudice that have become as effective as winning an election as they have at making a riot. I mean, to give you just a scale of things, I mean, India's ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party itself, employs and engages hundreds of thousands of people across the remotest corners of India, whose only job is to mangle facts and get at the party's enemies, whose numbers are endless. And the narrative that they create goes out everywhere, not just it's in mainstream newspapers, it's on 24/7 television news cycles, it's on radio, and of course it's on the internet. And more than 500 million people in India use internet every day. We consume, or we must be like the world's biggest users of WhatsApp and Facebook and Twitter. So it goes on. So just the amount of misinformation, disinformation that's going out from this infrastructure is mind-blowing. We're talking about one message every minute. And the effects of these messages are getting worse and worse. And right now, because you mentioned public health, I mean, this is, what we're seeing today is some of the cruel effects of that, the years of, that kind of like daily cycle of disinformation. So, I mean, one of the biggest threats to countering the coronavirus in India today are those videos and messages, whether they are attacking vaccines, or they are promoting fake cures, or they are victimizing minorities for having spread the virus in the first place. We are in a very bad shape here.
I'm so sorry. I just realized I was muted. That is terrible. What a rookie mistake. I've only been doing this for over a year. Sorry about that. So I wanted to follow up with you by asking you about the Facebook Oversight Board decision and how you might think about this in relation to into Modi. As everybody knows, just as a background, I think probably everybody knows this, the Facebook oversight, the Facebook deplatformed, suspended Trump's account. They said, I think at the time they said permanently, as did Twitter, by the way, in response to some of his Facebook posts around the January 6th insurrection. They said that he was, contributing to the incitement of violence, and they suspended him. That was then turned over to the Facebook Oversight Board, which was funded by Facebook but operates independently. They just turned down their ruling. Many people, including myself, frankly, I thought they were going to reinstate him, quite honestly, because there's a lot of free speech advocates on the Facebook Oversight Board. Instead, they upheld the suspension, but, and this is critical, let me just read a passage from their statement that came out just, again, I'm still digesting it while I'm talking to you because it just happened 40 minutes ago. It said, it is Facebook's role to create necessary and proportionate penalties that respond to severe violations of its content policy. The board's role is to ensure that Facebook's rules and processes are consistent with its content policies, its values, and its human rights commitments. Then the Facebook Oversight Board goes on to say, in applying a vague, standardless penalty and then referring the case to the board to resolve, Facebook seeks to avoid its responsibilities. The board declines Facebook requests and insists that Facebook apply and justify a defined penalty. Therefore, they have upheld Facebook's decision to suspend Trump's access to post content on Facebook and Instagram on January 7th. However, as Facebook suspended Mr. Trump's accounts indefinitely, the company must reassess this penalty, and they have given Facebook 6 months to do so. So in other words, they're basically saying in 6 months, if you can't come up with a justified reason for a permanent ban, and you can't fix, I'm interpreting here, you can't fix and clarify your policies, you need to let Trump back on. So I'd be very interested in hearing your reaction. And again, SNIGDHA, I'll start with you. You know, particularly as it's probably impossible to look at this and not think about not just Modi, but you know, others in power and their statements, and your opinion about deplatforming or allowing heads of state to continue to communicate on these platforms.
I can't stress enough how relevant that sounds to us in India right now. Just last week, Facebook banned this hashtag called Resign Modi, which was, as you can imagine, Indians are in severe outrage against the government's handling of the pandemic. And so one of the hashtags to trend on social media could have been that, and it was that, except that for maybe a whole day or a few hours, Facebook banned that hashtag from appearing, and then had to release some lame excuse about how there was a technical error. But in just the past year, the Modi government's demands on both Twitter and Facebook, and perhaps even WhatsApp to crush anything that appears as dissent against the government has been crazily amplified. So, you know, we're talking about thousands of tweets being taken down, or thousands of accounts being deactivated at government's request, just because, you know, they're reporting, these journalists reporting from protest sites, or students mobilizing in the streets. So I think that the way that social media companies have completely given into the government's pressure in India right now, and increasingly is very, very troubling.
Yeah, that ban, even though it was only a few hours and they claimed it was a mistake, was pretty horrific. It was the people who were standing up to express antipathy towards the head of state. So in this case, it had the opposite effect of banning Trump. Maria, I'd like to get your response too. Obviously, very relevant in well, not just in Philippines, but everywhere. But your response both to the oversight board upholding the ban, but also they're giving Facebook 6 months to make a decision and possibly then reinstate him.
I think it's a decision that's neither here nor there, right? If you really think about it, so I to be transparent, I sit on the real Facebook oversight board, the alternative group that Carol Cadwallader, Shashank Zuboff, a group of us who feel like the design, who know that the design is itself destructive, and that there's a fundamental flaw that needs to get fixed for our information ecosystem globally to get better, right? To prevent these cheap armies on social media from tearing down our democracies. I think this goes back to the root of the problem. Who will make the call for algorithms that have already made the call, right? So when will you switch from neglect to values, to principles? And I think that's the biggest problem. Leadership needs to kick in here for Facebook, frankly.
That is, as I'm sure the oversight board would tell you, out of their scope. So you're saying banning individuals one at a time is not the solution. And I think that's an incredibly valid point to be made. Peter, I'd love to hear your reflections on the Facebook oversight board decision.
You know, like whatever. There are a bunch of very very clever people. I respect all of them individually. As a system, it all looks a little bit weird. Some sort of jury appointed by the company, making, you know, decisions to the best of their knowledge. But look, we need something a little bit more sustainable. The companies have said that they want to govern their platform along the principles of international human rights. The only way to really police human rights is through human rights courts. One suggestion that I've heard from human rights lawyers is that we would have a system of e-courts online, where decisions around things like content moderation, you would be able to sort of like address a judge, and he would make the decision around this. And this would be done at scale, at rate. We'd need a whole new system to support this. So, I mean, look, we need something bigger than simply like, you know, an oversight board making occasional judgments on these very complex, very important, high-profile decisions. We're talking about, you know, thousands and thousands of of decisions that need to be presided on in a transparent and kind of consistent way.
Yeah, that is an issue, right? They're one at a time. They take 3 months to make each individual call. Daisy, anything you'd like to add here? Oh, now you're muted. Glad it wasn't just me.
Am I?
There, you're good.
Okay. You know, ultimately, I have to defer to my colleagues here who are much more in the milieu of looking at the social media giants. But I would just add, you know, in our part of the world, we see numerous cases where organizations like RT very effectively bring challenges to organizations like Facebook that are that speak to what Maria was saying, the issue of neglect rather than values. So we had an interesting case just last week where RT, which is ramping up operations in Germany ahead of elections there later this year, has a group called Redfish that is nominally about covering issues related to the Holocaust. And they were removed from Facebook because of an apparent violation related to nudity, of all things. I'm not actually even sure what the post was about. The only media organization that has reported on this is RT, reporting on itself. And yet that story allows them to make a strong case of bias on the part of Facebook, and allows them to enter a milieu with other media organizations who will be bringing other more valid complaints related to being taken off the platform.
It gets to issues of noise in the system. Daisy, while you've got the floor, I'm beginning to turn to audience questions. So please keep them coming. We have some good ones. We'd love more. So Daisy, the question, there's no name attached to it, which is fine, but we'd ask those of you who feel comfortable doing so, please add your name or at least where you are in the world. It's just helpful. Daisy, the question is it naive to even ask if this kind of visceral triggering, we're talking about the boy that was alleged to have been shot by a drone, another crucified. Does it is it naive to ask if this has diminishing marginal utility? In other words, is its efficacy a little diminished each time? Do publics wisen up? And if not, what is the longitudinal effect? So I would call that the boy who cried wolf syndrome.
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting question. And, you know, remember that the first instance they used this was 7 years ago. So it's not a tactic that they're going to pull out of their pocket every week. They will almost certainly would have diminishing returns if they did. Here, I'm not even sure that the public reaction or the public outrage is the end goal. But just as the journalists at Radio Free Europe and probably everywhere in this region, on the day that story broke, we're thinking, oh my God, something terrible has happened to a child, but what's Russia doing? So there already is that built-in expectation that a story has an ulterior meaning or motive. And again, they use it in a variety of ways to resurrect a certain dialogue with the West, to point the finger at Ukraine, and maybe to just temper expectations among the Russian audience about, well, what's happening with this troop movement? So they can use it in a variety of ways, and organic, genuine public outrage is not necessarily absolutely mandatory at the center of that exercise.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for that perspective. The next question comes from Warner Speed, who is a staffer for the U.S. House of Representatives. It is a question for you, Peter. The question is, you suggested that one person, one voice may help tackle disinformation online. What would a one person, one voice policy look like? Should IP addresses be limited to one account on various platforms? Or do you see one person, one voice as a purely anti-bots network policy? And if so, what would that look like? I had the same question. I'm very curious about your thoughts about how the one person, one voice would.
So there's different sort of proposals around among people who are much more technologically gifted than I think. Ronaldo Lemos actually is one of the most interesting thinkers on this subject. He is a member of the Facebook Oversight Board. And if you remember, he brought in the Brazilian Bill of Rights the Internet Bill of Rights. So his idea is something he calls self-sovereign identity, which would be, again, I'm trying to sort of explain the philosophy of it rather than the technical details here, but it wouldn't be so much like the Estonian version where just the government gives you a passport. It's more that the integrity of your identity would be built up over time through the different places and ways that you've established yourself. So there wouldn't be any one thing. It'll be your university degree, your driver's license, something else that you've done. And that would slowly build up the fact that you have some sort of common, genuine integrity and identity. You can look it up. I think there's a Wikipedia entry if you want to get into the weeds called the concept of self-sovereign identity. But the trick with this thing is how do you get the kind of integrity of identity balanced with freedom, safety, and non-reliance on state or even corporate entities to sort of give you that identity and know that about you. Right. So there's a bunch of different ideas being developed about how to approach this, but the main thing is to start that conversation having that as an aim.
Yeah, and self-sovereign identity, of course, allows you to be anonymous. You don't have to have your real name attached to it, but that identity is always attached to the same individual. This is very popular in decentralized web and blockchain-based networks. It's a very interesting proposal. Okay, next question coming up is, let's see. This is a question from Ann Miller. If algorithms know how to target individuals with hate-based posts, why is it not possible to insist platforms develop algorithms to delete those posts or at least to counter with factual information? So, this is a, Maria, I know none of us are software engineers on this group, but yeah. I know you spent a lot of time on this, so I'm going to give this one to you.
Yeah, I can pick it up. I think first you have to think the way it works is that every post you put into Facebook or Twitter, machine learning picks it up, right? Over time, it creates a model of you that knows you better than you know yourself. Then AI picks up all these models and then serves your most vulnerable moment to a message, to a company, that's the new advertising, or to a government, the new propaganda. So that's the framework of how that works. I think what you're asking is, could machines do this on their own? This is the biggest problem. No, they can't. Because in order for AI to be able to do that, you are going to have a huge data set of something that constitutes hate speech. And right now, we're actually even debating what hate speech is, right? This is why journalists are the ones who make these judgment calls when it comes to being liable for something, right? So I think that's the fundamental problem. Throwing it to tech as a solution is an abdication. That's more what I meant, Vivian, that in the end, part of the problem is that the tech platforms keep putting off to tomorrow decisions that have already been made and are embedded in the platform. So the real question I think you need to ask is, how do you change the incentive scheme, i.e. surveillance capitalism, the profit motive where hate actually makes more money for the platform? How do you change that incentive so that you have a viable information ecosystem? That's one. The second is, how do you actually stop the impunity? This was my appeal in 2016 when I started getting attacked. We asked Duterte and the brutal drug war an end to impunity there, and an end to impunity in the attacks on Facebook, because there are real actors that are manipulating people on there. So how do you stop that? And I think the way you do that is by making them responsible for it, the same way that, if you slip on the snow outside someone's house, you could sue them. I know, like, I just brought you to 10 million places, but they're all connected.
But let me just stick with you for a minute, because this is important. You're saying, how do you change the incentive structure? The incentive structure is baked into the business model right now. So who is going to, so let's just assume for a second that the platforms or Facebook, let's say in this case, is not going to undermine their entire business model to solve this, who can end this impunity? You're saying the courts, a regulation? What needs to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think right off the top, because I could go to jail if this isn't addressed immediately, right? In the short term, I've spent the last 5 years really appealing for enlightened self-interest from the platforms because it is also in their interest. But the incentive scheme of money is too much because you have, how much did they make last year? $29 billion in net profit. Right. So when you make that much money, it stops you from thinking medium and long term and the kind of impact it can have on society. So, yes, now it's regulations. And who's looking at that? The EU is more aggressive. They have the DSA, the European Democracy Action Plan, has 2 different drafts of legislation. The UK has the Online Harms Bill. The United States, which is frankly the one that has allowed American social media platforms to do this globally, is stuck on Section 230, right? And that again goes back to your fundamental question. Journalists could never have gotten away with doing these things, but we could have pulled out bots. We could have done these things that manipulate people, but we had a set of standards and ethics. We had a mission. We knew we needed to protect the public sphere. So this is a problem because now we lost our gatekeeping powers. It's in tech's hands. And they are going to have to do something even before legislation comes.
Yeah. Well, Maria, as you would expect, I completely agree with you that journalists have a lot of the answers. We as an industry have been dealing with these issues for generations. The concepts are not new. The engines are new and great and scaled, but the concepts of speech are not new. SNIGDHA, let me come back to you and ask you about, while we're on the topic of regulation, do you see an impunity? What do you see in India? How do you see any chance of regulation or any kind of legislation that would out of the government that would around the platforms? Pending?
The platforms keep saying that they're aware of the problem and then they are doing their best. So both Facebook and WhatsApp run these public awareness campaigns in the villages and in towns and cities, getting people together, telling them about what fake news is, how to identify it, how to counter it. But as some of you were just discussing, it just doesn't align with their interests. As I mentioned earlier, the numbers of Indians who use these platforms are humongous. They are, no social media company is going to alienate a user base of that scale by really piling into the fake news issue. So I don't see that being very helpful. What I think really needs to happen in India's situation, because again, just think of the numbers. Every day, hundreds of thousands of people are getting online for the first time. They have absolutely no awareness of what's coming at them or tools to identify fake news from facts or let alone counter it. So I think that until these fake news isn't taught in education curriculum, in schools, people are not told about it. This should be in textbooks, and people should be taught how to what it is, how to identify it, how to counter it. There should be many more public workshops. Maybe development organizations can step in. Maybe the international community can put more pressure on the problem that I described earlier of this politically manufactured, government-funded, huge infrastructure created to circulate fake news and bigotry and propaganda and falsehoods. And I think that until that is not dismantled, I see things becoming worse and worse for the region.
Your comments are related to the next question that came in. This one from Amanda Connell. She asks, what kind of policies are being created in governments to include curriculums on misinformation and comprehensive media literacy? What needs to be done to educate stakeholders from a young age around consuming information critically? So I'm happy if anybody would like to jump in on this. Of course, I will just say in the United States, there is no such thing as a national curriculum. It's done at the local level. So that would be very difficult to do in the United States, although there are many efforts here in the US to make available on a voluntary basis to school systems news, media literacy to help educate kids. But I'd love to hear any other reflections on whether this how this would help, whether created by government or not. Daisy, you have any point of view on this? Are we seeing anything like this in your neck of the woods?
You know, it's interesting. I live in the Czech Republic. It's where RFE's headquarters are based. And here, media literacy is part of the national curriculum. So you will see classes about media literacy, which I thought was quite progressive at the time. You know, it's my sense with we don't broadcast to the Czech Republic or based here, but for the countries where we do work, perhaps this is a slightly cynical response, but I think that people there have a first-rate understanding when it comes to media literacy, because they are perfectly well aware of ownership structures and who is speaking to them when they tune into one or another channel or pick up a particular newspaper or go to a particular website. I think this tendency is extremely pronounced in a country like Ukraine, but not only. So I think that I've seen a level of sophistication among news-consuming audiences in our part of the world that I would say is far greater than sometimes what I see in the United States, where I think everyone, at least of a certain generation, comes in with a notion that they're all there to more or less deliver the news in an upstanding way, perhaps with a few outliers on either side. So the question of media literacy is something that can be addressed in programming on behalf of journalists, but bringing it into the school system, I think, is quite merited.
This next question is specifically for you, Peter. In your latest book, This Is Not Propaganda, you argue that propaganda is not about proving something, it's about casting doubt. The person asking the question, anonymous, a questioner, could you share some examples of this phenomenon unfolding around the world, including the US, or is it still mostly focused on Russia and Vladimir Putin's propaganda machine?
Right, so that's an excellent question. I mean, I wouldn't reduce all of propaganda to this function, but I think as a tactic, it's very, very old. The most famous example, I think, and perhaps in many ways the most impactful example, is the disinformation around the connection between tobacco and cancer, and then between fossil fuels and climate change. There's a podcast series, How They Made Us Doubt Everything, on the BBC you might want to listen to. It may be presented by me, I don't know. I'm not sure, let's cast some doubt. But look, that's where it's most famous. But what we've really seen is that approach now multiplied beyond the kind of the narrow needs of corporations into the political sphere, which is very, very interesting. Because you're right, politics used to be about persuading people to join an army, take up a cause, believe in an ideology, believe in a leader. And I suppose part of this just comes from, you're a propagandist or you're an authoritarian propagandist. Even you can't control your media environment. Even Putin can't control his media environment. There's going to be things coming in. So in order to kind of build an identity, the first thing you need to do is make people doubt everything. Don't trust anybody. I'm corrupt, everybody's corrupt. That source over there, they're fake news, and so on and so forth. But that's just the first step. First you cast doubt, first you undermine faith, and then in that vacuum, you start to build identity. Yes, you don't know the truth, but this feels right. This makes us feel good. So doubt is the first step. And the second one is to build identities on top of that kind of epistemological wasteland.
So this collapse of a foundation of evidence-based reality that used arguably we used to then points of view would then be built at least on that foundation of evidence-based reality. Now you're saying,
sometimes, Vivian, occasionally.
Yeah.
Often, but sometimes that happened. Let's not overstate what it was. But
Right.
look, the same thing happened with the climate change stuff. It was knock it down, make people not believe everything, take the climate change issue and make it a political identity. I'm Republican, therefore I don't believe in man-made climate change. That was the very interesting part that happened over decades.
Right, and we of course have seen it play out in the United States with the big lie that the election allegedly was rigged, despite ample, vast, irrefutable evidence to the contrary, and yet the big lie persists. Maria, I'm going to bring this one back to you, since and it is a question from David Batts, who asks, what should journalists or Western democracies do more or different to resist an extremely effective PSYOPs program coming from adversaries of democracy? What can journalists and news organizations do?
I think the first thing is, we have to live this. So I actually attack it on three pillars. The first is tech. So on tech, we're advocating. We actually we show you the evidence of manipulation, and we are asking for guardrails. I'm working. Vivian and I actually, and Peter worked on the not the real Facebook, the other one, Forum on Information and Democracy. The infodemics, we came out with 12 systemic solutions, right? Instead of taking this as a whack-a-mole solution. The second is you've got to let independent journalism survive. You've got to help that. So we're going through a valley of death because the advertising model has essentially collapsed, co-opted by tech. The money has been taken in by tech, and yet the risks of doing journalism have increased. And then the last part is to also look at your community, right? So Vivian, you mentioned earlier the big lie, right? But that's the information operations that created the election fraud narrative, right? And this is the way it works in every country around the world. It was seeded in August 2019 on RT, the election fraud, picked up by Steve Bannon on YouTube, and then seeded in closed Facebook groups. Then it was Tucker Carlson that picked it up. After that, QAnon dropped it. By Tucker Carlson, I think it was already August 2020, September 2020, QAnon drops it. And then President Trump comes with it top down. That's a narrative that was this meta narrative, which goes bottom up and top down, which ended with January 6th, right? That is information operations.
Yeah. And didn't end with January 6th, unfortunately. I'm going to just stick with you for a minute, Maria, because this next question so perfectly dovetails with the last one. It's almost the inverse. Does the mainstream, it comes from Janique Meekins, does the mainstream media outside the U.S. also play, this is outside the U.S., but I'm going to expand this question to say in the U.S. as well, also play a game of false equivalence and or both siderism when the choice is between fascism, authoritarianism, and democracy? How much does this dynamic influence the anti-democratic outcomes of disinformation? I mean, to me, you'll go ahead.
No,
you're the panelist.
No, go, Vivian, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Maria.
It influences a lot because this is a tradition of journalism we come from, right? It's pretty much that way now all around the world. We've been trained that way. But here's the big difference, and this is why social media was such a game changer, why it upended everything. Because in the end, like Peter told you, it's about it's seeding doubt, it's breaking down trust, right? And then rebuilding a meta narrative on top of it. That was the Russian disinformation. But what it does is when it is a battle for facts, journalism becomes activism. And this is something that I think journalists all around the world don't want to embrace. And that also has us handcuffed, right? It took me a long time to be able to say journalism is activism. It did start as activism a long time ago. It is back to that now because without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. George Shultz died this year. He was the one who said, In 100 years of his biggest lesson was, if trust is in the room, you can do anything. Without trust, you can do nothing. And that is a problem we have. We have no shared reality, which means how can we deal with these existential problems that our world is facing today? Climate, you named it, coronavirus, and facts. Democracy, how can we even deal with this without facts?
Right. Journalists must be activists when it comes to truth. SNIGDHA, I want to just turn to each of you, just because I want to just stick with this question, and then we're going to actually turn it up to our keynote wrap-up speaker. Is it a keynote when it comes at the end? We're going to call it that. SNIGDHA, the same question is, how do you balance your role as a journalist when you see, deep falsehood or lies on the one hand and evidence-based reality on the other?
No, I could go on and on. The discussion has just turned really, really critical for me, because what Maria said speaks so much to me. I never wanted to take anyone's side in what I report, but the space for journalists like myself, some of my colleagues, has become so small in India that no matter what you do, you sound like you're taking sides, which I think that personally I'm still trying to reconcile myself with. But but there was someone who asked a question that I found really interesting about this fake balance making, and especially in the mainstream media. And it is so true. I remember researching misinformation cycles in India ahead of 2019's general elections, and just looking at thousands of messages every day for weeks, it was clear to me, plus making some Excel sheets, it was clear to me that the BJP was, the ruling party was manufacturing or sponsoring much more volume of fake messages, fake news than the opposition. But the editor that I was working with kept saying that we need to sound balanced, so I should also include equal number of examples of fake news being peddled by the opposition, when at the larger scale there was absolutely no comparison. So I think that I now work independently, and I think that as Maria said, one of the things that we can do to fix what's going on in these regions is to support more independent journalism, because one of the worst damages of misinformation in India as I see it, is that facts are losing their meaning to the public, and it become really hard for me and my colleagues to work in this environment where people don't trust you.
Well, I have to say, support independent journalism is about as a good a message as I can think of to end this section of our program. I'm sorry we've run out of time before I was able to get to the others, but I just want to say thank you so much to Daisy, Maria, Peter, SNIGDHA. This has been a fascinating conversation. There were so many more questions we didn't get to. We could have drilled down on each one of these topics for hours. So, and we will at other times in other sessions. But in the meantime, thank you so much to all of you for your time. And for those of you who are watching, hold on, because we have our finale coming up. As we say goodbye to our panelists, I'll let them go. And again, thank them again for their important work in defending democracy around the world. It is now my great privilege to introduce my colleague, which is also my privilege to be able to say, Chris KREBS. Chris was appointed by then President Trump as the nation's first director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA. Among his many accomplishments, not the least of which was helping ensure the integrity of the recent elections. And in assuring the public of that integrity, he also then had the great honor of being fired by the man who appointed him, President Trump, who fired him via tweet. So, but Chris, even before that auspicious moment, defending democracy, had a long history as a cyber policy expert in both the private and the public sphere. He is now co-founder and principal of the KREBS Stamos Group. But as far as I'm concerned, his most important role, in my completely unbiased opinion, is as the Senior Newmark Fellow in Cybersecurity Policy at the Aspen Institute, the Aspen Digital Program of the Aspen Institute, and chair of our new bipartisan group we are calling the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder, which was designed to come at solutions for many of the challenges we have been addressing today. So Chris, it is my privilege to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Vivian, for that introduction. Good morning to everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. I had some prepared remarks, but given this morning's events, the announcement from the Oversight Board, and that brilliant conversation that preceded me, I think I'm going to rip them up and kind of and go with a more inspired off-the-cuff remarks here. We'll see how that works. Well, first things first, I want to kind of give you my experience on how I came into the disinformation and intersection of democracy. And then I'll talk about maybe some of the lessons learned over the last 4 years, at least from where I sit in the United States, and then some of the conversations about where we go from here that we're having, both in the Commission on Information Disorder and some of the broader conversations. I do think that this is a fascinating time, at least in American history, where when we think about 2016, which was perhaps the more recent, more modern experience that we have faced with a broad disinformation or really a propaganda campaign. 2016, it had been quite some time since the fall of the Soviet Union and active measures campaigns that they have wielded so well. In fact, I tend to think about if intelligence operations are the world's second oldest profession, then disinformation is likely the third oldest profession. And we saw that quite brazenly used in the 2016 election here in the United States, where the Russian government conducted 3 different lines of attacks and attempts to interfere in that election. First was more technical attacks, and I think that's what probably was the most visible, the most apparent to at least over the last 4 years, of the things that we were concerned about, of protecting the election systems themselves, the machines, the equipment that help facilitate the voting process. The second, which at the time was most likely the most visible, and that was the hack and leak operations on political operatives like the Hillary Clinton campaign, the Democratic National Committee, getting in there, getting emails. We saw that same technique used subsequently in France with the Macron leaks. And then third was this broader destabilizing disinformation campaign, at the time using social media platforms, including Facebook and Twitter. And I can remember quite vividly now seeing some of the Twitter accounts and the tweets posted, for instance, by the GOP, the Republican Party, alleged Republican Party account out of the state of Tennessee. Turns out that was, in fact, part of the Internet Research Agency operation out of St. Petersburg. And so over the ensuing 4 years, when I came in to the Trump administration and led the Cybersecurity Agency at the Department of Homeland Security, I was principally focused on helping our state and local officials, which are under the Constitution responsible for protecting or administering elections, federal elections. And as we help them improve their cybersecurity, as we worked through a range of different scenarios about disruptive effects on elections, and most importantly, the confidence of the American voter in the election process, what we ultimately came down to is the most concerning threat, the biggest risk to elections, was, as David Sanger from the New York Times coined at the time, or at least last year, coined as a perception hack, where they could make a claim that a system was penetrated, was being manipulated, and despite all available evidence to the contrary, had manipulated the outcome of the vote. And so about this time last year, and then moving over to the summer, that's when we really moved into a position of, okay, how do we spot these things or identify them in advance and build up an understanding of how the systems actually work in the United States? How do we get ahead of a disinformation operation and have a more informed populace? And so we started pushing out guidance. We started hitting the press circuit pretty hard. We started doing speaking events, and we made some progress. But then, as the fall came along, and there were claims of a Central Intelligence Agency supercomputer and program that was manipulating votes, it caught on. Like Maria said, the seeds were planted years ago, and as they moved into the information ecosystem and started hitting the super spreaders, these things kind of went out of control. And I, sitting there in my seat as the director of the agency responsible for protecting our elections, was a voice in a much broader asymmetrical risk environment. And yet we continued to push forward. We developed concepts such as rumor control, where we would not amplify the disinformation. Instead, we would give authoritative factual information from a variety of sources, sometimes the very law itself and the experts that administer elections, again, to educate the media, to educate the public. And yet, January 6th still came along because we had a volume problem. We had an asymmetric threat problem. At the time when I was fired in November, I had 10,000 Twitter followers. So me tweeting about rumor control was not going to be able to match up against someone with 80, 90 million followers. So what we truly are battling here is an asymmetric threat across our information platforms. And so that brings me to what I think we have learned here in the United States, even if we have had the luxury of being inside an information operations bubble for the preceding 20 years. Many other countries, many other geographies out there have been dealing with these issues from a number of different autocratic regimes. And in the United States, just recently has really come to terms with these threats. So first and foremost, the way that we began viewing the disinformation ecosystem was a push and a pull, was a supply and demand problem. And so to counter disinformation operations, yes, you can continue to disrupt the supply. You can go out there and identify the platforms, you can identify the accounts, you can identify the specific claims, and you can disrupt that. And there are a range of different national authorities, from regulators to intelligence agencies, to law enforcement, and even to defense ministries and agencies that can be used to engage to disrupt those. But that is a game fundamentally of whack-a-mole. You will be chasing the next seed or seedling that pops up. You will always be going after the next fringe element. And that's okay, because in doing so, you make the spreaders, the disinformation operators, change their tactics. You impose costs on them by introducing friction into their operations, by deplatforming them and making them go to more fringe operations. And that's what we saw between 16 and 2016. There were prevalent bot accounts, fake accounts that were operating on Twitter and Facebook. But over time, they had to transition off those platforms because, yes, Facebook and Twitter did improve their ability to detect at least the inauthentic coordinated behavior. And so they start moving to journals. They start moving to a constantly expanding media empire. It's not just RT, but there are a range of other platforms and media outlets that are connected at least second, third ring out. But again, we are making them shift. We're making them change their tactics. But ultimately, one of the most important aspects that I think of the information ecosystem that we identified was the demand problem. In this post-truth world, where we are unfortunately living in different realities, people want to feel that they belong to a certain community. They want to believe information that's presented to them. And so a lot of the big lie, the fraud, people couldn't possibly believe that the person that they supported in former President Trump could have possibly lost that election. So the big lie resonated with them. And this gets back to trust. So when you don't have truth, where do you get trust? And so going forward, that is going to be an area, as we just heard in the last panel, that we are going to have to seek out those mechanisms, those structural aspects and elements that allow us to regain trust in our information ecosystems. And that's going to include accountability from our leaders, from our government. That's going to include accountability on media. That's going to include accountability on our social media platforms. We're not nearly where we need to be right now. And unfortunately, we are not going to be able to do this alone as individual countries. It is going to take democracies worldwide working together to share experiences, to build coalitions, and ultimately push back on this seeming rise of authoritarianism that is sweeping the world. And I look forward to being a part of that effort through the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder. And I hope that you too will contribute to this effort. So again, thank you to Aspen. Thank you to the U.S. Agency for Global Media for allowing me to share a few thoughts with you this morning. Good luck and be smart consumers out there.
Thank you so much, Chris. Brilliant insights, and I love the connective tissue you've drawn from some of the comments from the panel. In particular, I think Maria Ressa's comments that without facts you can't have the truth, and without truth you can't have trust really resonated with all of us. And so I think it's a great one of the great lessons that was learned or shared with the group today. So thank you so much for your comments. Thanks to everyone for a great discussion. I learned a lot, which is my favorite part of these kinds of things. I really appreciate the active audience contributions too. We had a lot of questions and a sizable group of folks tuning in. So thank you for your attention this morning, especially given everything else going on. I hope we can continue this conversation on Twitter. We are at USAGM.gov, and please do use the hashtag M4DF if you'd like to connect on this issue. A recording of today's panel will be available on our website, usagm.gov. I hope to see you on May 26th for our next panel discussion, this one in partnership with the Committee to Protect Journalists. Thank you and good day.